Welcome to As the Story Grows. I'm Brian Patton. Today we welcome Alien Weaponry bassist Tūranga Morgan-Edmonds to the podcast. Alien Weaponry released Taniwha back on March 28th with Napalm Records. Tūranga talks about the struggles and changes within the New Zealand music scene, the importance of showcasing the band's Māori heritage and language, the cultural story that inspired Taniwha, making connections with Indigenous people around the globe, and more. It took a while to get this episode booked and recorded, but it was worth the wait. I think you guys are going to like this one a lot. Thanks much for listening to this episode of As the Story Grows. If you're a brand new listener to the podcast, thanks for checking us out. You can find links in the show notes to the podcast mailing list, our Discord server, and the Patreon page where you can get early access to every episode for $1 a month if you're a fan of what you're hearing. And if you like what you hear and want to hear more, make sure you subscribe to the podcast on your podcast platform of choice. Enjoy today's conversation with Tūranga from Alien Weaponry. I mean, the new record's out, so how's the reception been so far?
Oh, dude, it's been crazy, man. You know, like, obviously as a, well, you would like to hope as a creative who's releasing any body of work that you are happy with it yourself, you know, and you can say that, but really you never know until it's in the hands of the audience, you know, or the consumer. And we were definitely nervous going into this one because the second album was varied in its response. You know, and I think that's to be expected when you try to make a significant shift in your direction between something. You know, people obviously fell in love with the first album. Second album, the boys were like, okay, let's just try something different. You know, let's see where we sit and see where our audience wants to go with us. And obviously there were people who were like, yeah, I kind of like it, quite like it. And then there was the other side who was like, oh, no, don't like this at all.
Yeah.
And so we were like, for this album, we were like, we're trying to avoid that. We still want to be able to try and be pushing ourselves creatively, but we still want as many people as they can to enjoy it. And obviously you can't win over everyone, but preferably our own audience to still enjoy the music that we make. So that release day was, you know, can be a little nerve-wracking, I think. And then all of a sudden everyone's like, this is amazing, oh my god, you know, or this early in the year, top 5 albums of the year and best album we've ever made kind of thing, kinds of responses, you know, which is awesome. That's exactly what you want to be hearing, and it's very very heartwarming to see, you know.
Yeah it's that tough balance of like, how are we fulfilled creatively without alienating everybody who likes us? Some people reach a point, I mean, I guess at some point you don't give a fuck anymore, but like,
you know, and
I feel like everybody comes back eventually, right?
Exactly. And you know, we're still fresh, of course, you know, like we're still a young band, we've got a lot to go, and we also, because of where we live and how far away we are, it's not easy for us to do this. It's not easy for anybody, you know, but it's not like we can just get in a car and then drive and play the next biggest festival down the road for a weekend. You know, we have to fly all the way across the world. So we can't do one-off shows and all these little things that maybe if you're more fortunate to live closer to these things can do. So we kind of acknowledge the importance of this album for us as well in our career, you know, to kind of cement us in the scene for another few years before, you know, it's a very fast moving industry. It doesn't take long for you to be forgotten by people and moved on by the next biggest thing. And, you know, there are definitely huge bands out there right now that have just shown up out of the blue, so to speak. And, you know, you always got to be moving, got to keep moving and got to stay relevant, so to speak.
Yeah. I think you might be my first artist I've talked to from New Zealand. What's the music scene there like? I've talked to like artists from Australia, and I know things are so spread out. Cities are all over the place. What's it like in New Zealand though? And especially for a band in the heavier music genre?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing here because on one end, you've got the, like, you know, huge bands like Slipknot can come and play our biggest venues and that sort of thing, like No Sweat, you know what I mean? and people will show up for bands like that. But then when it comes to that more like localized fan base, once upon a time, it was a lot more for like extreme metal.
Yeah.
You know, so unless you were already famous or you have a really extreme metal band, there was this kind of interesting gap where that's where we sat of this kind of like little too heavy, so to speak, for someone on that end of the spectrum, and then not nearly heavy enough for that end of the spectrum. Right. Which is why the band in its early years spent so much more time overseas than they did here in New Zealand. Also, of course, we're not a huge country, so we're bigger than people think, but population-wise, we're bigger than people think on a scale size of it. You know, when people come over here, they're like, oh, it actually takes a lot longer to drive around than you think. I'm like, yeah, we are bigger than the maps make us look. Yeah. But the population is not matching that, you know. Mm-hmm. And so there's only so metal already is a relatively niche genre here. And then to be able to play enough shows here to be a sufficient, self-sufficient act is nearly impossible. You know, our biggest bands or whatever are definitely not heavy metal bands. So it's but we just finished the New Zealand tour about a month ago. Mm-hmm. And it was easily our best tour we've ever done yet, you know. And obviously we've gotten bigger in things over the years, but it was all playing shows outside of New Zealand. So we didn't really know what to expect. Did our own country still remember us? You know, where do we sit in our fans' eyes here? But one thing that we noticed was like it's a lot more younger people coming out to our shows on this tour than we had in the past, you know, because I would also say that like the metal fan base here, when I joined the band, when we would go out to play a show, it was a lot more older people, like older than us and 40s, 50s. And so this tour, it was like a lot more young people like, whoa, wow, what's happening here? And I don't know if that's because like metal as a genre around the world is kind of in this boost right now, you know, like bands like Sleep Token and Spirit Box and these sorts of younger bands that are bringing the bringing a new passion for heavier music onto a new audience. I think is like, it's a great thing for a band like us who are young, you know, to be introduced to our generation of fans that give us longevity, you know, because obviously the 50-year-olds one day are going to be 70 and then 90 and then gone. So you don't want to entirely build your fan base off of people who are going to be gone before we are. Right. And then I think, you know, when we first started, or the last tour that we did, I should say, maybe those people that are coming to our shows now, they weren't old enough, you know, 5 years ago. They were teenagers under 18. And a lot of our venues, you have to be 18 because of our drinking ages or whatever. And now they're 18. So, you know, we had a lot of people come take photos after the show like, oh, this is the first time I've seen you, you know, and I've never been able to see you before and blah, blah, blah. And so that's really awesome to see as well. So I think it's a growing scene here for sure. And it's awesome to see it sort of start flourishing. One of the problems we have in this country is, even though that distance is longer than people think, the country is still small. Mm-hmm. And we expect, as a country, we expect people to come to our towns. Yeah. And that, I think, is our current hindrance in terms of growing local. Because when Slipknot comes, everyone goes, oh yeah, I'll drive all the way to Auckland to go see the show. For sure, they're worth my time and effort. But when it comes to local bands, everyone's like, come play my town that's only half an hour away from this town and only half an hour away from the other town that you're going to play. So instead of, you know, getting a nice sold out show of, I don't know, 800, 1,000 people, this country expects you to do like a bunch of little shows for 50 or 100 people, you know, and it's like, but that doesn't always work out. And so it's like, just get in your car and drive half an hour or an hour, you know, and but that's something in our psyche as a New Zealander, because we think everything is so small and close and communal like that, that is the slight hindrance. I think it's the one thing holding our local bands back. Is that lack of drive to go and actually support bands. You know, we get so many people who are like, oh my God, I wish you were coming to my town, and we're only playing an hour away, you know. Forget where we've had Americans drive 18 hours to come see us, you know, like ridiculous numbers, of course, because of the scale of that country, but they understand what that can do for a band to actually show that support, you know. And I'm like, you did it for Slipknot. You know, obviously we're not at the same level as Slipknot, you know, but I would argue then you're spending even more money then to go see someone like Slipknot, or, you know, our tickets are definitely not Slipknot prices, for example. So then the gas travel or whatever is not nearly as much as it costs for the whole thing for you to get all the way to Auckland for whoever. So I think that's the one thing right now kind of holding our country's scene back a little bit.
Yeah, I get that. You're not an original member to the band, so how did you get connected with the band and start playing?
Yeah, so I went to school with the boys, so, you know, we've grown up around each other, and me and Henry were in bands together, like non-alien weaponry bands in school, and my brother was good friends with Lewis, and so when they got to the point of looking for their new bass player, you know, that I think I was one of the ones that popped into their mind first, like, oh, you know, let's us too. At the time, I wasn't a bass player, you know, obviously I'm a guitar player by the multitude of guitars behind me. And I was like, okay, sweet, I guess I'll go buy a bass. And I went to the local music store and I bought the cheapest bass on the wall and gave it a go. And here I am 5 years later now. So
yeah, it worked out.
It did.
This bass that I own, I was playing drums with this girl and she was like, well, you could play guitar, so can you play bass? And I was like, sure can, and bought that.
Yep.
That was that.
Yep. That's literally all it takes. And I was like, I actually quite enjoy it, you know, because obviously I still play guitar. I really only ever play bass because of the band. And even when it came to this third album, like I wrote the songs on the guitar. I recorded the guitar in the studio, not for all of them, but for the stuff that I wrote. But it's funny because if the part in the band was for guitar, I'm not sure I would have said yes, you know, because the one thing about me playing guitar is because it's like my instrument, I get so much more nervous playing it around people, you know, where like when it was bass, I was like, who cares? I can do whatever I want, have fun, slap it around. And even if I make a few wrong notes, people don't really notice on bass unless it's really off. And so I think that's half the reason I even said yes in the first place, because prior to joining Alien Weaponry, I hated performing. Like I liked being in bands, but like to jam at home, you know, I hated being on stage and I hated all this and that. So like to join a proper touring band was a bit of a shock for me at the time. But I ended up loving it. But I love it because I played bass.
That's funny. Last album was released September of 21. You joined the band, from what I see, 2020. I know New Zealand was not nearly as strict, or my understanding was New Zealand was not nearly as strict with lockdowns because of way more precautions you guys had in place, a better governmental response. What was kind of that joining the band in that time frame and kind of that album release like for you guys?
Yeah, it was very strange. You know, I think the reason the swap was able to happen though was because of that lockdown, because I think the previous bass player, Ethan, he'd been considering it for a while, you know, but they were so busy touring, it kind of was like difficult for them to actually finalize or have the time to sit down and figure it out. And then all of a sudden you have no choice but to stay at home. So then it was kind of like, because at the time I was living where I used to live in Wellington, where I was at university, you know, and I was in my apartment, like locked in there doing my university homework or whatever. And then that's when Henry messaged like, what are you up to, you know? And it was because of that downtime that I think it allowed that swap over to happen in a nice relaxed manner too. It wasn't this sort of situation of, oh, we need a new bass player, oh, and then we're about to go overseas to America for 7 months straight, you know? Which would have been like, for me, I would have been like, whoa, what the heck? Having not performed on stage for years. Mm-hmm. And then the last time I performed on stage, I hated it. To then playing, you know, a full-on international tour would have been wild. So it was nice that it was these kind of stepping stones of, I had to obviously drop out of university. I moved all the way back up here to where the band is based, which is about a 10-hour drive from where I was living at the time. So I had to pack up everything, come back home. This is my home, like with my parents, you know, because this is where the band was based, of course, where we went to school, and we live in a very small community, you know, so it's like there's nowhere to live. So I've got to go back to my parents' house, and it was like quite a big shift, and it was made a lot easier because everything was drawn out over all those lockdowns, and it was just kind of slow and steady, and I had time to learn the songs and get in the flow of how it's like to work with the boys in terms of in a band that's like a working band. Obviously I hadn't been in bands with Henry for years and years, so didn't really know where I was at. And then the album side of it was tricky. That's where I think it was like, because for the changeover it was great, for the album not so great.
Yeah,
it was like the release was in a funny spot, and we weren't able to tour, of course, because everything was locked down, and so it just kind of floated in this ether of like forgettableness, I suppose. And like unless the album really, really, really made an impact, like for example, the same day that second album released, Eternal Blue, Spirit Box's Eternal Blue released, so it's like that was an absolute album of the year album. And it's like, so and if we're being honest with ourselves, we didn't quite hit that sort of album. You know what I mean? So so many factors at play came around during that second album that made it all fall a little bit flatter than we would have hoped. But thankfully we've made it through that, and here we are still to be in the place to release a third album. We're grateful that we made it through those very strange years it was strange for everybody. Everybody suffered during that time, so we're just glad we're still here to share our music with people.
One of the things that's important to you and important to the band as a whole is Maori and Indigenous culture. Why, I mean, outside of your background and your heritage, what has made that so integral and important to the band?
Well, this is something that's sometimes hard for people to believe, because a lot of people look at New Zealand as one of the leading examples of a modern relationship with their Indigenous peoples, and by all means, we're not the worst. We've traveled the world, and I've seen how other countries treat their, First Nations and or Indigenous people, and it's bad, So we're no means the worst, but we're also not great.
Not as good as people think.
And not as good as people think. And for example, so we grew up being told, nobody cares about your language. Nobody cares about your people except your own people. Mm-hmm. So just speak English. You'd be better off learning Mandarin or Spanish or, whatever. Who cares about Māori this, Māori that? And so every time we play a show overseas and you've got a crowd of Americans singing in Māori who would never normally have any reason to sing something in Māori ever, it proves that wrong, And why that's important is because there are a lot of people here who do not get to experience that, who don't have the same privilege to be able to leave the country and experience other people's opinions and absorption of our culture, where all they used to is the people telling them nobody cares. Yeah. So what happens there is they just go, I don't even want to have anything to do with being Māori. I'm just gonna forget about it. I don't want to be part of my own culture. I'll just blend in and assimilate to what I'm told. And then they see, I don't know, the news shows up, alien weaponry, haka in Denmark, and 10,000 Danish people are doing a haka for alien weaponry, and it makes people go, whoa, what? That's crazy. I didn't know people outside of our country even cared, because they've been told for years, and many years before I died, before I was born, rather. Many years before I was born, this has happened. My grandparents were beaten in school for speaking Māori, and obviously we're much better than that now, but being beaten is... being told nobody cares is just another step down, It's all ways for them to push out these cultures and try to just make us one European-centric culture.
Yeah.
And so for us, that's why it's so important for us to be able to spread this awareness and education with people, because it allows those who don't have the benefit of experiencing the world to see how the world experiences us, So it's awesome to be able to do that.
Yeah. It's always great to see bands kind of express either the country they're from or their native language and culture. Because, so much of the music industry, it's like everything's in English all the time, no matter where you're from. And it's like, it doesn't have to be like, if the song's awesome, people can connect with it, it almost doesn't matter what you're saying. Like,
right.
It matters to you, but as a fan, like, your album is still fucking incredible, even if I only understand half the songs, right?
Right. And I also think, like, you know, because there's a rise in bands that no longer need to speak English. You know, you've got The Who, you've got Bloodywood. I always forget the name of the Scandinavian band. But, you know, obviously Rammstein were kind of the forefront of that. Yeah. Not that German is nearly as rare as Māori is to speak, but you know, it still applies.
Yeah.
And I think a big reason it's more accessible today is because of the internet.
Yeah.
You know, you can just Google it now. There doesn't have to be such a disconnect between the language and the listener. You know, you don't have to speak German to Google what Rammstein is singing about or what we're singing about, you know, which is awesome, you know, because once upon a time it would have been difficult and isolating and alienating of your audience, because either they'd have to have the CD or the booklet that had all the translations in it. But now it's like, oh, Alien Weaponry. Oh, what language are they singing in? Google. What language are Alien Weaponry singing in? Māori. Yeah. Oh, cool. Alien Weaponry, Māori to English translation. Boom. And then there they are, you know. So, like, it's so much more at our fingertips now. I think it makes it so much more widely accessible, you know, around the world. And but then there's also that element that, like, sometimes they don't care. I'm sure we have plenty of fans who never look once at what we're singing about. They're just like, woohoo, I love this. It sounds cool, you know, and that's fine too. That's fine too, whatever floats your boat. And I think a lot of that comes from, because there's been so many years of English. Now it's so hard to be different. You know, how do you be different as a band? What's your gimmick, so to speak? I never liked that word, but, you know, it's like everybody needs something to stand out now. And so I think for a lot of people, they're just like, oh, cool, it's not in English, you know, because we still have fans of ours who don't like our English stuff. Because then they're like, it sounds like every other band, you know. I'm like, hey, whatever, man, whatever.
New album is called Tira. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, Tira.
Yeah. What is the concept behind the album title?
Yeah, so about the middle of the album, there's the song, which is the title track, Tamanui Tera. And Tera is just a shortened version of that full name. And Tamanui Tera is the Māori name that we give to the deity that is the sun. Okay. And so the actual Tera translates to the sun, the day. And it was inspired by a famous mythological story that features Maui. And a lot of people will be like, oh, like from Moana, you know. And the answer is yeah, pretty much. It's he is a very significant Polynesian demigod, you know, so he's not unique to Māori, he's across the entire Pacific, and he had completed a bunch of significant feats, kind of like a Hercules of sorts, that gave us things around us. So he was very famous for fishing up the islands of Polynesia, and one of the other things he did was he slowed the sun down to give us the days. So in that story, the sun is like flying across the sky at light speed every day, and the entire day lasts 1 hour. And Maui is like, this sucks, we can't do anything, you know. So he gets his brothers, he goes to where the sun lives. In this story, it's in a pit in the ground, which is what's depicted on the album cover. And he lays a trap for the sun, essentially, and then they catch the sun with like enchanted rope and hooks, and then basically he beats it up. He just beats the sun into submission, and the sun goes, sorry, I'll slow down, and then gives us the full 24-hour days. So that's a story, and it's the reason we chose that story was it's like, to our memory, and probably to a lot of even New Zealanders, you know, it's like the first Māori myth or Polynesian myth we learn about growing up. You know, like I think you would even argue that you could ask non-Māori, like, what's the Maui story, you know? He's like, oh, slowing the sun, Tamanui Tera, you know? So it's such a significant story. It was one that we wanted to share with people, you know, because it's cool to share. That's one thing I do like about Disney's Moana, is it introduces people to another realm of mythology and story. From another people around the world, you know, so we kind of just furthering that with one that is nostalgic and hits home for us, you know, and also makes for a great album cover too. You know, like it's cool, it's the sun, nothing's more striking than the sun, and so that's what the album cover depicts too, is the sun flying out of the pit, adorned with the facial moko on the sun.
You talked about approaching the songwriting into this record almost in response to the last record and being a little lackluster. What were things you knew you wanted to either recapture or try differently?
Yeah, so we wanted to achieve the catchiness of the first, you know, because it's like, what was it? Is it just the grooviness? Is it the singing? What is it that people loved about the Alien Weaponry sound across both albums, though? You know, we also wanted to take the highlights that were in the second album to further develop our sound. So from the first, it was the songwriting itself, the catchiness, the structure. From the second album, it was the technical improvements. You know, now that we're no longer teenagers, to show people that, you know, one of the gripes of the first album was, oh, it's so simple. You know, it's 2 notes, blah, blah, blah. But now, of course, we're men and we've been playing our instruments for 10 years more than the first album, since when the first album released. And so we're hopefully better, you know, and able to reflect that in our songwriting. So, and then the third thing was the live show. So one thing that we acknowledge is a lot of people love us specifically for our live show, even as extreme to say, like, we get a lot of backhanded compliments from people who go, I don't even like their music, but I would pay to go watch them live because their energy is so great, right? So we appreciate that in its weird way.
Yeah.
But so for us, that means we acknowledge, like, our show is like a big part of why people fell in love with us in the first place, whether they saw us at a festival or opening for, you know, Gojira or whoever it was. That's where a lot of people fell in love with us, was live. And so one thing we had also noticed about the songs on the second album was, when, even if we liked them, we were like, oh yeah, I love that song, let's put it on the set list. When we went to play it live, it kind of fell a little flat, you know? So one of the major focuses on this album was, how are these songs going to work live? Because obviously we don't know what people are going to love on the album. So when, you know, the album's been out for a while and we can see what people are listening to, we want to be able to put it in the set list, and it's going to be responded just as well live as it did, you know, listening to it at home. And we were fortunate enough to be able to put that to the test before the album release. We did a New Zealand tour and nobody had heard the songs yet, but we were playing them in our set list because, you know, we never know when we do a New Zealand tour. So we're like, who cares? Let's play all the new album on this tour anyway. And so we'd be like, you know, you don't know this song, but doesn't mean you can't go crazy in the pit. And then we'd start playing the song and the pit goes crazy, you know? And it's like, that's what you want to know. That's what you want to see.
Yeah. When
the audience have never heard the song before, let alone when they go home and they can absorb the song so they know it. So the next time you play it, they go, oh yeah, it's the song, let's go crazy, you know? So I think we managed to achieve that going forward. And that's what we hit. That was our goals before hitting the studio. And then Josh Wilbur added like another element to that. And he saw other things that he was like, oh, you can totally develop this and even, you know, make this better. And vocal melodies was a main thing for him that he focused on, was like, Lewis is such a good singer.
Yeah. He
should sing, you know? And we had that little middle elitist in the back of our head going, oh, but if we sing, they're going to call us soft and whatever. And Josh was like, who cares? You know, you're the one playing shows with Gojira and playing these huge festivals, not them. Yeah. And you should be utilizing every ounce of your skill set to make your music, you know? So why would you have a guy who's such an amazing singer not sing? Yeah. So then, you know, we kind of had this little bit where we were sort of back and forthing a bit. And then we were like, okay, you're right. You know, we should listen to Josh Wilbur. Josh Wilbur doesn't seem like the sort of person you say no to.
Right.
And then obviously this album is filled with great hooks, and a lot of those came from Josh, you know. Nice. So that was really awesome to be able to work with someone like that as well.
Yeah. It seems like we're in a great era of like bands just writing incredible choruses and hooks and memorable songs, and this album has no shortage of like songs that like you can bop to and get stuck in your head. So
totally.
Yeah. You mentioned the New Zealand tour. There are currently no tour dates on your website. What is your plan looking like for the rest of this year? Is it trying to figure out what makes sense, waiting for offers, or just...
Yeah, it's a lot of waiting and figuring it out, you know, because for like, obviously we're about to hit the European summer circuit,
Yeah.
but we only did that last year. So is it likely we'll hit that this year? Maybe not. We'll probably be looking at next year. We do have some stuff that we have had confirmed to us from management, which is very exciting stuff.
Yeah.
And so we're just waiting for the public announcement for that. So do stay tuned on that, because for me, it's a dream tour, this one that we've got coming up. So that's a hint for anyone who really knows me. So really excited for that. But who knows when we announce all that, but there's stuff coming for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. There's obviously, you want to go everywhere and have your music be everywhere, but are there places, whether it's North America or parts of Europe, where you've connected a little better, where people seem to get it?
Definitely anywhere in the US or North America, actually, where Native American or First Nations people are. The best shows we ever play are with the Navajo. So that's anywhere in New Mexico or Arizona, because that's where the reservation boundaries are within those two states. Like we played Albuquerque at the start of the year with Kerry King. Off the rails, and we have a Navajo flag. It's in my cupboard behind me here, and we put it up on stage, and when we went up on stage, we're like, the last time we were here, we were playing for the Navajo Nation, and the crowd just erupted, and that was our way to gauge like how much of the crowd was from the Navajo, right?
Nice.
And it was like a good chunk, and after that, they were off the rails,
Nice.
and which was awesome to see, because on that tour we were the first opener, of course, so we only had the half an hour slot. You got half an hour to win everybody over, and you have to assume that most of the crowd has no idea who you are. We found the same in Canada with a lot of the, I think it was the Blackfoot Nation up there, were coming out to a lot of our shows, which was awesome as. So those places always have a very special place in our heart, particularly the Navajo. We've got a long-standing relationship with them, and it's kind of cool. Like, we feel a little bit at home too when we visit those places. Like, they're a completely different people and culture, but the way they are and the way they live is so reminiscent of the way that Polynesians are. You can't help but feel a little bit closer to home, even though you're absolutely not. Which is nice, though, especially after 6 weeks on the road and you're starting to get a little homesick. It's quite nice to visit these places. But we have not played South America yet, though, and this is one place that I've been told by everybody. Every single band we've ever toured with is like, "Have you played South America yet?" And we're like, "No," and they're like, "You just wait then. They are the greatest crowds in the entire world." And everything that we post on social media, there's somebody in there saying, "Come to insert South American city," So maybe this album will be the time that we get to hit South America. Who knows? But it's one of those places we are waiting very, very patiently impatiently, I should say, to grace their shores for sure.